All right, let's dive into a really fascinating paradox that's happening right now. At a time when so many of us feel kind of lost, millions are actually turning back to one of the world's oldest belief systems for answers. So today, we're going to explore the data and the arguments behind this really interesting trend.
So let's just start with a question that, I think a lot of us feel on some level. We live in a world with more information, more connection than ever before in human history. So why do so many people report feeling this profound lack of purpose? The data suggests this isn't just a vibe, it's a real measurable crisis.
Get this, in just the last decade, depression among young adults in the U.S. has jumped by a staggering 60%. And a huge piece of that puzzle seems to be people feeling adrift, just not sure what they're supposed to be doing with their lives. But that's not the whole story.
Yeah, because as this crisis of meaning has gotten deeper, we're seeing this counter-trend that honestly a lot of experts just didn't see coming. People are searching for answers, and they're finding them in some, well, maybe surprising or maybe very traditional places. The data gives us some really interesting clues here. Weekly Bible reading? That's up 12%. Christian music streams have surged by 20%. So what on earth is behind this renewed interest in faith, especially in a world that feels more and more secular?
So first things first, we really need to understand the roots of the problem. What exactly is this modern meaning crisis, and where did it even come from?
Well, sociologists point to a few key things. There's this rise of what they call expressive individualism, this idea that my whole identity is about discovering myself by myself. It's left a lot of people feeling kind of unanchored from any bigger community. You throw in the isolation of remote work, and you get a culture that's constantly telling us our self-worth is basically tied to what we do and what we achieve.
In this quote, man, it just nails it. We bought the lie that we are the sum of our actions. I mean, think about it. When we believe our value is just a total of our accomplishments, what happens when we lose your job or fail at something? It can spark a complete identity crisis.
Okay, so how are people responding to this feeling of being adrift? Well, the data is pointing to a return to faith, and in a way that I think would surprise a lot of people.
Despite all the headlines we see about the decline of religion, the numbers tell a much more complicated story. A solid majority, 63% of U.S. adults still identify as Christian, and after years of decline, that number has actually started to level off and in some cases even tick back up.
And it's not just about what box people are ticking on a survey. Look at this number, 19 million. Bible sales just hit a 21-year high, with 19 million sold in just 1 year. People aren't just saying they believe, they're actively digging into the foundational texts of that belief.
This renewed interest, of course, leads to a massive, and I mean massive, question for any modern evidence-based thinker. How can we possibly trust a collection of texts written 2,000 years ago? Is it even historically reliable?
Well, from a purely historical standpoint, this is pretty fascinating. If you compare the sources we have for Jesus with the sources for his contemporary, the Roman Emperor Tiberius, well, look, both have 4 biographical sources. But the majority of the sources for Jesus were written in the 1st century, claiming to be from eyewitnesses. For Tiberius, most were written a century later.
Now, a common argument you'll hear is about the time gap, right, between Jesus' life and when the Gospels were written. But a lot of historians argue that this concern is a bit overblown, pointing out that the entire New Testament was written within the 1st century. That's well within the lifetime of eyewitnesses who could have stood up and said, hey, no, that's not what happened.
But what about stories getting all twisted over time, like in the telephone game? Well, that's kind of a misunderstanding of how ancient cultures worked. These were oral cultures. Stories weren't whispered from person to person one time. They were told publicly, in big groups, over and over again. A method that's actually designed to preserve a message, not corrupt it.
All right, so beyond the historical arguments, what about the content itself? Let's tackle some of the biggest philosophical hurdles that people have with the Christian faith.
And here it is, the classic problem of evil and suffering. If there's a good God, why is the world so full of pain and injustice? This is, you could argue, the single most powerful objection out there, both emotionally and intellectually.
The philosophical counterargument, though, is that our ability to even recognize something as truly evil suggests we have some kind of internal compass for what is good. The author C.S. Lewis put it this way: you can't know a line is crooked unless you have some idea of what a straight line is. That straight line points to some kind of universal moral law.
Okay,
Next up, the central claim, the absolute core of Christianity, the resurrection. This requires a belief in the supernatural, which for most of us is a really high bar for evidence. So what's the actual case that this event happened?
The case for it usually centers on a few key historical arguments. You've got the disciples who went from hiding in a locked room terrified to boldly proclaiming this message even when it meant persecution and death. Then there's the fact that the first eyewitnesses to the empty tomb were women, a detail that in that culture was actually kind of embarrassing. Proponents argue you would never make that up if you were inventing a story. It just lends it a ring of authenticity.
So, the crucial point. How do these ancient texts and historical arguments connect all the way back to our modern search for meaning today? Why does any of this matter right now?
Think of it this way. A botanist, let's call her Betty, can analyze every single chemical component of a rose. She can explain how it works. But she might completely miss the fact that her lab assistant, Jerry, left it for her as a Valentine's gift, the why. A purely scientific explanation can describe the world perfectly, but it can't always give us the meaning behind it.
And this brings us right to the heart of the Christian answer for the meaning crisis. It proposes that human beings aren't just, a random product of time, matter, and chance. Instead, it says you were created intentionally, with built-in meaning and purpose.
And here's why this is such a big deal. It suggests your value isn't tied to your job or your success or your productivity. It's intrinsic. It's just there. And your purpose, then, isn't something you have to build from scratch, but it's something to be discovered in who you were created to be.
So, we're left with a final question. In a world that offers us endless data but often struggles to provide a really compelling reason for our existence, where do we ultimately find our purpose? Is it in the things we can measure, or is it in something more?